Hello, my friends. I welcome you to another interview of Adhitya Talks. And today we have Mr. Rafael, and he's an interesting person. He's researching. He does a lot of researching in Brazil on games, and he's going to share his ideas on gaming. And he's going to share a lot of interesting information for all you children out there. So stay tuned till the end. So, welcome to the show, Mr. Rafael. Please tell us about yourself in brief for our audience.
Thank you for your introduction. My name is Rafael. I am a game researcher and also a lecturer. So I began my career as a bachelor and a master's in design, and then I did a PhD degree in the field of education. So most of my research was about video games or digital games and its relation to the society and to players and the impact that they have on players. Even though since I began lecturing the university, I began to lecture to people who are trying to develop games, who want to be game developers. So I am in between the world that thinks about games and the world that develops games. So that's that's me in a few sentences, I suppose.
Okay, thanks for sharing about yourself. So now, viewers, you have a vague idea about Sir, and he's a really interesting person. So, Sir, so how did you get into game development?
I think
Game,
what really,
yes.
yeah, I think it began with the stories. I think what really fascinated me was the stories. Initially, I was really interested in animation because I believe the stories that they convey can be really transformative. But then, after some time, I suppose I realized that digital gaming also offered a lot of possibilities of telling stories that I really liked. So I suppose it was this moment in my life in which I realized that I could do something in my career that was also related to something that I really loved. So, but the stories were the element that really brought me into games.
Okay, that's interesting. So you got through storytelling into games. Thanks about that. So how do you think gaming impacts lives in the modern era? Is gaming actually helpful for us? Because there is a lot of people who think gaming is a disruptful activity. What do you think?
Yes, well, we have to keep in mind that gaming is a very old activity. So since ancient times, people play games. Well, not digital games, of course, but they play non-digital games from a very old time. And some people would even claim that even animals play. Sometimes, you can see like dogs playing, and they're not really fighting. They're kind of pretending to fight to develop skills. So what we have is that it's a very ancient activity to play games and something that we see in very different cultures. So in cultures in different parts of the world developed ways of playing games. So I think the question is not about whether playing games uh, is something bad or good for you. It's to understand what are the consequences when games became digital, because in the 20th century, so we had this new phenomenon of digital games, and they bring games to a new kind of context of the digital world. And obviously it makes a difference, right? And I think the key point here is that the digital world creates a huge potential, huge change in the way that we play games. But this potential can be very problematic and can be very positive as well. So what I tried to convey in some of my research, it's not about telling people that digital games are either good or bad. It's more about understanding the possibilities and trying to make a good use of them. So it's not about, you know, they're not the foe, they're not the enemies, they're not allies. They're something that we have to use with wisdom. And I think they do in the positive part, they have a huge potential of being a very rich form of art, of expressing rich aesthetics, of telling great stories, and really creating very intelligent problems that players have to solve. That's all amazing, and that can be used for the best of humanity. But at the same time, we do have problems that can come with us. And in my view, the most problematic thing that we should keep in mind is when people play too much. So sometimes people get a bit obsessive with games, and they can play for too many hours, and sometimes it can hinder other parts of your life, your family life, your job, your studies, or your other forms of socialization. Let's say having friends not only in the game but outside of the game as well. So the problem comes when people begin to play too much, especially, and I'm also worried when people play games that are way too repetitive. So we can understand games as this amazing digital universes, that can you explore and know different worlds with different stories and really make you think and really make you socialize and interact with people. That can be all amazing and nice. But sometimes people play games in a very repetitive way. They just do the same again and again. It's a bit similar or analogous to some kind of drug, because they operate in your brain to make you a little happy, and then you just need a bit more and a bit more. Of course, it's not a drug, but it has a behavior that can be quite repetitive and not so healthy. So yeah, I think that's a powerful tool that we have to use with wisdom. That's my view of that.
Yes. So what you're trying to say, it's not game which is at fault. It's like more of the human side. We tend to play games a lot, and that's why we consider gaming bad. So it's a little bit addictive, but yeah, it is not necessarily bad, and it's a unique style of art form. Thank you for sharing that, sir. So, what are the digital gaming practices you have observed in your research?
Yeah, so in my doctoral research, I did have the opportunity to talk to a lot of young people about how they play. And it seems to me that one of the best things that can come from playing games is making friends and interacting with people. And I believe that if we use games to create bonds with people who we like, family and friends, it can be very powerful and create very nice memories, playing together. That's something very powerful of games. Um, so I would probably say that that's something that I would encourage people to do. Not only play games, do other things as well. But when you play with someone else, you have the chance to cooperate, but also to compete with in a healthy way, in which you're both kind of testing your skills and having great emotions together. Joy and sometimes anger, and sometimes just excitement. So I would say that's one of the most important elements of gaming, the social side of it.
Okay, so that is certainly interesting. So you have encountered many practices during your time as researching in gaming. So what is reflective gaming course, and is its positive and negative influences?
Yeah, so the reflective gaming course was something that I proposed in my doctoral research. It was like a course, so something that you could apply and do like a module. But instead of studying, let's say, biology or mathematics, you would basically discuss how you play games and how you want to play games and how you can play games in a critical way, or in other words, how you could play games in a way that's good for you and actually acknowledge the problems that come that can come from gaming. So I did have the opportunity to offer this course in some UK schools, and to create these opportunities in which youth could discuss what are the games that we play, and questions like, what do we learn from the games that we play? Do we learn anything? And how could we learn more? But also, we also discuss themes like stereotypes. You know, uh, do we find stereotypes in the games that we play? In the history of the digital game industry, we had lots of problems of how women are portrayed in games. So sometimes women are, sexualized, or play the role of someone who is powerless and just waiting to be saved or something like that. So
Yes.
stereotypes, not only of women but also of, people of different racial backgrounds, they can be very they can make a very bad influence on us. They can change the way that we see the world, and we don't even realize. And
Yes.
there are studies showing that. There are studies showing that if you are exposed to, for instance, sexualized imagery of women just for a short time, it changes the way that you judge a woman right afterwards. So they can be very problematic. But the problem is, most people believe that they are not affected by such stereotypes. Most people would say, oh yeah, stereotypes in the media and video games and TV, they're quite bad, but they don't affect me. They only affect the other people. That's called the third person effect. They only believe that the stereotypes affect the other people, and they are immune. They are not affected, and that's an illusion. So one of the points of the reflective gaming course was to encourage people to acknowledge the stereotype and counter it. So if you are aware that the stereotype is there, and you discuss it and you see why it's bad, it helps you to counter the stereotype rather than just consuming the stereotype without thinking about it. If you see, for instance, uh, games in which the women are always like in a very kind of weak position, they are powerless, they cannot do anything, they're just waiting to be saved, very slowly you begin to think that women, or it may happen to you that you may begin to think that women are not as powerful or competent. So you have to actively think about that, and play the game being aware of those kind of problems. So the reflective gaming course was more about that, acknowledging the positive things that could come from gaming, especially ways of making friends, socialize, and also learn something, and train your mind to solve complex problems. It was all the process of being aware of these good things and make them better, but at the same time acknowledging the problems, like stereotypes, like obsessive play, when people play too much. And it's funny because normally people are aware that they play too much. So,
Yes.
and sometimes it's good for them to discuss, to talk about this with others.
Okay. So please elaborate and advise terms like tangential learning, cognitive
Hmm.
gains, and excessive gaming. How does this impact the youth? We already know about excessive gaming, but what about others?
Yeah, so those are some of the terms that we discussed in this course with the youth. One of them was tangential learning. It became actually very kind of popular amongst the digital games field, after in YouTube video. It made very popular the term tangential learning. The tangential learning means when you are, let's say, playing a game and you see something that really makes you motivated to go and do research somewhere else and to learn in the process. So let's say that you're playing a game that happens in ancient Rome, let's say a specific place in Europe, and then after playing the game, You just feel that the game made you very motivated to search. So you search, let's say, in Wikipedia, and you read about, the Roman Empire. It's a historical, relevant knowledge. So the game did not teach you anything. You didn't get any knowledge from the game, but the game made you interested and curious. So you went on and did some research in other source, like Wikipedia, and you learned in the process. And that's normally a very rich process of learning, because the person is really motivated to learn. It's not something like, you are in a classroom and the teacher comes and he or she says, you have to learn about the Roman Empire now, and then you have no choice. You just say, okay. But if you're really interested or really curious about the topic because of a game or because you saw in a movie, it really makes you have a richer learning experience, and that's tangential learning. And in my experience, it happens a lot with players, video game players. Most players that used to play a lot of gaming experience, at least once that had the experience, and they could tell me about this experience of doing tangential learning and learning something inspired by gaming. So, and the other aspect that we talked is cognitive gains. It's more about how playing games can change some of your cognitive faculties, like attention and memory. So there are some studies, Daphne Bavelier is one of the famous scientists who did some research in this area. And she would say that if you play some action games, even like first person shooter games, that can be quite violent. But anyway, if you play them for a while, it trains your brain and it increases your attention power, and some games also increase your memory. So at the end, depending on what games you play and how you play, how much you play, how much time you play, it can be very stimulating to your brain, because games at the end are basically a problem, right? You're paying for a game, you're basically paying for a problem that you want to solve. And you want a problem to solve that's funny to solve. That's kind of the essence of a game. So lots of games can be very challenging to your brain, not only in terms of intelligence and strategy, but also in terms of, quick thinking and attention and, this kind of cognitive processes. So we also talked about this kind of studies and whether they applied or not to the games that students would normally play. The whole point about the reflective gaming course was to be aware of this potential of gaming impacting your life, either for good or for bad.
Yes. So can you can you tell us what are about the influences of gaming, like cognitive and aggression? Please explain its effects. And since it's really interesting, you're explaining all these terms in a such simple way. When I was reading your thesis and all these things, I really did not understand, but it's really simple. Thank you for explaining. I hope my viewers, you're also understanding, and stay tuned till the end.
Yeah, well, when you talk about cognition, then it's more about what I said before, like your attention, on your memory, and this kind of processes. What some people are doing now, they are doing research on whether you could use some video games as some kind of therapy. So if you need some kind of training to your mind, train your attention or memory, could you use games as a therapy? That's something that people are doing research about. But the point of aggression and violence, that's a very sensitive topic. There are lots of research about digital games and violence, and it's not a topic in which scientists would normally all agree. So there are different perspectives and points of view. So I would say that it's still a kind of open question about what's the relationship between video game play and violence. But in my view, what we could consider is, well, the first thing is, one of the things that make very complicated to discuss video games and violence, it's because sometimes there is some kind of panic in the media. I'm not sure how things are in India, but I suppose people may be aware that in United States, they lots of cases of violence and shooting violence
Yes.
became quite famous worldwide, and some people would believe that there is an association between violent crimes with guns and violent video games. And when we begin to get into this kind of panic and believe that, all people are going to become like murderers just because they're playing violent games, when we get to this point, we're not really being very rational anymore. We're just kind of panicking and creating fear. And so there is an exaggeration in that sense. And that's a problem because it makes the discussion more difficult and the public opinion more difficult. But at the same time, there are different kinds of perspectives that suggest that we should be careful about the quantity of violence that we have in video games. Because even though, if you are very young, if you play, violent video games, well, you're too young now, but let's say if you are a bit older and you play violent video games, it's not like you're becoming a murderer because you're playing these video games. That's not really the problem. But the problem is more about we creating a culture that is kind of used with violence all the time. And it happens not only on video games, but also on TV and movies. And the idea that, things are solved with, guns and blood. So it's not about cause and consequence. The person becomes a murderer because he plays video games. It's more about creating a culture in which we kind of accept this more and more, the culture of violence, the culture of guns. So it's not about excluding all violence of games. It's more about understanding the age rates. So, some people are too young and it's better if they wait a little bit more until they play violent games. It's better for them. But also how we can create different kinds of stories, because the stories that we tell, they create a sense of what's life, right? And if we are always telling stories about people in war and killing each other, that's how we see the world after some time. So rather than excluding violence in games, it's more about also having other kinds of stories and other kinds of values in the games, at the same time that we respect the age recommendation. So it's better to wait a bit if you're too young. It's just, they are there for a reason, the age ratings. But it's not like, as I said, I mean, there are studies suggesting that, for instance, if you play violent games, you may, right after you play, you might have some more aggressive behavior. Like maybe you're going to want to, to hit something, but it's not like
Yes.
killing someone. But
Yes,
there
of
are
course.
also, but
Yes.
there are some studies also suggesting that competitive gaming makes you more aggressive than violent gaming.
Yes.
So let's say if you're playing football video game with your friends, it's very competitive, right? Football, it's not violent, but it is competitive. If you lose the game in the last seconds, you may get really angry. And in this anger can make you feel more aggressive for a short while, more than if you were playing, let's say, a game with blood and guns. So there are lots of subtle things in this equation, I believe.
Okay. So there's I would like to just give an example of like there are a lot of like people, children here in India who are like very addicted to gaming. There was a case, I don't know when, but I heard there was a case when a child played like for 7 hours continuously playing a game called PUBG. I don't know if you know about it, but he played and he died of a heart stroke. Like because he was screaming, like he was like very competitive. I don't know about that, but yeah, it's like it's a bad aspect of gaming. But with that in mind, what do you think is the future of gaming? How do you think it is going to evolve in the future? How can it change and become better and contribute to the society?
Yeah, I have the impression that there are different dimensions to that. I think in terms of technology, what we will see is intensely immersive technology, like virtual reality. They tend to become more common. But then, of course, it's just my guess. But virtual reality and augmented reality, they are very immersive tools, and they can reach a new level of experience in terms of gaming. So we already have those, but we're probably going to see more. And we also have gaming mobiles. So that's something that probably came to stay, and we are probably going to see more and more sophisticated games to mobiles because they're just so popular. Smartphones. I believe that the game industry as a whole, let's say in a global level, it's also evolving in terms of stereotypes. It's evolving slowly, but the games are getting more diverse. We're seeing more, women. We're seeing, for instance, women being represented in a better way than they were like 10 years ago. And, not only in terms of gender, but also in terms of, all sorts of racial identity, people with disabilities, the LGBT community. They are all being more accepted in the game industry, so it's making it more diverse, and I believe that's very positive. It is evolving very slowly, and it's not like that's solved. We still have problems of representation of women and all these people that I said, but it's slowly getting better. And but in terms of things like you said, someone who died because he or she played too much, there are some initiatives of some big companies that try to avoid that it happen. So let's say games that perceive when you're playing too many hours in one go, and they give you advice, something like, hey, you're playing for 5 years in a row, what do you think about giving a break? So sometimes there are big companies that are thinking about these kind of strategies to avoid a behavior that is too destructive. But at the same time, companies are having better and better tools to manipulate the user, to manipulate the player. So the industry is getting more better and better to understand how to make players do what they want players to do, because lots of player behavior is designed. So for instance, something that really makes people play too much too often is when you play multiplayer games, because multiplayer games online, they
Hello.
use peer pressure on you, that depend on you to play. Or when, for instance, let's say that you are in kind of a very competitive game in which your friends depend on you to have higher score and this kind of thing. When you have people who you care about, who depend on you, it can be very difficult to people to not engage in gaming for too many hours, because the peer pressure is such a strong force. And big game industries are knowing better and better how to manipulate players. So I think the critical view of players will be more and more important, right? really thinking about what am I doing with my game practicing? Is it too much? Am I doing it in a nice way? Am I aware of what's doing to my life? That I think that's something relevant to keep in mind.